Have we got any more questions? Yes, got several hands. John, we've got a couple at the front and one at the back.
I'm Sarah Thurman. I'm from one of the large housing associations. Sorry, I just had to say something. I think not yet. I think it's definitely challenging for us to work in particular communities. It's inevitably going to be, but I think it's slightly naive to say that we all need to shrink and we need to stop, to swap our stock and just find one small area, because we also have a lot of potential, I think, in terms of developing communities and nurturing communities. One of the things we're doing at the moment, we've set up a capacity building program with NCBO, because so many of the community organisations we're working with and voluntary sector organisations are collapsing because their funding is disappearing. So we're putting into place capacity building activities with them and funding them, and we can do that all over. It doesn't have to be in one particular area. We're giving properties to some of our community organisations to base themselves with, and I think we should be doing more of that. So I'm working internally to see what I can do, where we can't rent places out commercially, can we have peppercorn rents and really build on what we're doing already. And we're also doing stuff with like the Plunkett Foundation, for example, looking at buying shares in community shops. So I think there's lots of things that we can do that don't necessarily mean that we have to be in one particular geographical area, but sometimes it's easier.
Okay, that's great. There's a gentleman in the second row here.
I'm Titus Alexander from People Can. We used to be the Noah Staff Group. And I was very struck by the reference to long-term partnerships, working in the long term, and also the capacity building, the Leadership Academy and Kirklees. And that seems to be crucial for this kind of development. One of the problems we've had over quite a long time, in fact, is short-term funding, short-term commissioning, local authorities not commissioning because they're worried about their money, and also around leadership development. How do you sustain leadership development when, again, funding is often short-term? So it's really about incentivising long-term. How do we incentivise politicians to think about long-term commissioning, long-term partnerships, and longer-term funding?
Okay. Do we have any other?
Miami Open Impact Housing Association in Cumbria, we were one of the small ones. I was reassured to see Hattersley still around. I last visited there 35 years ago when I worked for Manchester Law Centre, and they were struggling then, so they're still struggling. But I think that's the issue with community groups, isn't it? We struggle, and sometimes we thrive. The only way we're going to thrive in the future is if more money comes into the local communities. There's only two ways of doing that. We've suggested the supermarkets, but other than the saviours from the retail sector, I think the only thing we can hope for at the moment, I'm coming around to a question now, is the government committed to transferring contracts, regional, national contracts and district and county contracts down to local community-led organisations? Because I see that as the only way at the moment we'll transfer power and resources down to local communities when there's not much else in the offing.
Thank you. And finally, gentleman right at the back, John, and then we'll patiently waiting.
Matthew Gardner, Trafford Housing Trust. My observation on what you do with an association that's recalcitrant, go and find one that isn't. It's quite simple, work with Coalition of the Willing. There are plenty who do want to do this kind of stuff, and that leaves the field, I think, easier for those of us who are in that camp. But that wasn't my point. My point is around the measurement of this. Housing associations yesterday saw the value for money standard that they are going to be expected to achieve under the new regulations from the Tenant Services Authority and the Communities Agency. That is very explicit about what value is, and it is written in a sense which is about sweating assets, and it describes value engineering as merging. That'll help localism. It describes it as contracting out. That's going to help as well. So my question is, how do we develop some metrics which actually demonstrate what the social value of all of this is, so that housing associations properly can demonstrate to their regulator that value for money includes doing this stuff and not just building houses?
Okay, right. Let's start with housing associations' potential, they don't need to shrink. Steve, do you want to pick up on that point? There it is.
I'm actually not arguing for housing associations to shrink. I'm arguing for them to relocalise. I think it'd be very good if housing associations continue to grow, but grow locally, so that they become really important, sustained, high-impact players in communities. And I'd like to see community organisations, homegrown community organisations like development trusts, like Fresh Horizons, also grow. So it's not an argument about scale, it's an argument about community and local. And the kind of things you're talking about housing associations getting behind, for example, community share issues in village shops, fantastic. Absolutely support as much of that as possible. Just on social value, can I have to demonstrate social value? Well, I think we're going to see over the next year one of the biggest changes of all being a change to the shift in contracting and procurement, where social value suddenly, in a big way, comes on the agenda. Chris White's social value bill is going, hopefully, through the parliamentary stages. We've had in August this year the DCLG statutory best value guidance that makes it a requirement on best value authorities and government departments to consider social value as well as price in all procurement exercises. The way that this is being framed is that the people bidding to run services can themselves define what they believe the social value should be. So you get all sorts of creative ideas coming forward. A task, therefore, for procurement people to decide which is best. Goodness, they might have to exercise their judgment about it, which would be great. But I think this is a very big and positive agenda. Nobody ever is going to create an absolutely satisfying metric about how to define it and give it numbers. I don't think.
Okay, Tom, did you want to say something about whether the government's committed to transferring contracts to community organisations?
Yes, it is. It's a sort of simple answer, but sort of everything else, particularly what Steve has just said, is sort of why this is quite tricky. So the Open Public Services is a very clear statement about opening exactly that, public services up. The question then is, well, who to and who are the beneficiaries? So some of the method, whether it's the best value guidance, whether it's the measures of social value, become important. And the practice of what is going on is quite interesting. So I have heard members of the Cabinet basically say what is going on is people trying to do the right thing but not yet doing it in the right way. So very, very large contracts costing huge amounts just to tender for. And so the sort of revolution or the second push on this, which Steve hints at, I think will come, because I think if your question was, has what the government has done, does it achieve the ambition? No, it doesn't. Is it committed? Yes, it is. And in a way, I mean, it sort of feeds back to the very first question about rights. The ambition is really clear. If what the government is putting in place doesn't happen, so if rights don't get taken up, I think there is really a kind of legitimate question, which is, well, what are you going to do about it? Or was it just a kind of, localism rhetoric, basically? And I think that debate will emerge over the next year, because the things that I talked about are on the statute book, so the translation into reality, that's really the test. So I'd expect that debate to carry on, basically. Okay, thanks for that. Karen, do you want to say anything? There was a question about long-term funding and short-term funding. So a natural.
Absolutely. I mean, the Venture Capital Fund has been fortunate in this year in that government did take a small step towards longer-term funding. Community Builders was endowed to Venture Capital Fund, which gives us the opportunity to build it as an evergreen fund, so that the recycling of the repayments come back in and we can continue to invest. So I think the government has, taken a small step to look at that as an issue. I think certainly from our perspective, having the freedom to manage a long-term endowment makes a huge difference in the approach we take to investing, and also helps the organisations we invest in, because it's much more a long-term commitment than
here's a grant, spend it quickly.
Okay, thanks for that. And Mike, did you want to say something about coalition of the willing, I think?
Yeah, it's finding those willing partners can sometimes prove a struggle for smaller community organisations. We have 8 registered providers within our area. We approached 30 in one way or another to try and get a partner to access homes and communities agencies without success. Which then leads us to the question about example, about how do you encourage? We ended up using the ALMO, which couldn't actually access the Homes and Communities Agency, to bring us to the table, to raise our profile around housing with the local authority. The local authority then tried to tried to encourage, and we managed to end up with one of the 30 who had rejected us 18 months earlier, who are Connect Housing, and I'm fantastically grateful that they have come forward and are very keen and working very positively. But sometimes finding the willing can prove harder than you think. The other thing about the issue of scale and where is procurement going? I think the work programme hopefully will have shown government the disaster of trying to deliver something at that scale. In West Yorkshire, we have got the lowest amount of voluntary sector organisation within the work programme in the whole country, so perhaps I'm being slightly overbitter. But what it has, the effect of the work programme combined with other cuts has meant that lots and lots of access to employment activity has disappeared out of the neighbourhoods where it is deprived. It's kind of become invisible. It's run by major corporations within towns or city centre locations, which mean all that activity around people stepping over that threshold, volunteering to try and get support back into work, visible presence within the most deprived communities has disappeared. So I'm hoping that the work programme, and if they're not even going to publish the figures, that might give some indication of how successful it's currently being at the moment. I'm hoping their experience in that will try and put it back to where it needs to be, which is in the heart of where unemployment sits.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, I think we've run out of time. John's nodding at me, so that means we definitely have. I'd like to thank the panel for responding to the questions. I'd like to thank you all for coming along today. Hopefully you found it really interesting conversation, not just an interesting video, but some interesting questions and answers to an emerging part of the government agenda. And finally, I'd just like to thank again our funders around this, Caroline for kind of putting some money into it, and also DCLG. And we look forward to working with you as this agenda emerges, gets clarified and gets taken forward. Thank you very much and happy Christmas.